What happens when the reigning Olympic champions make all the wrong moves? In 2006, Team Canada entered Turin as hockey royalty, but left with their crown shattered. From questionable roster choices to uninspired play, and a devastating showdown with a young Alexander Ovechkin, this is a story of how it all went downhill. Stick around, because we'll not only break down the disaster, but also chart the path to redemption as Canada prepares to return to Italy in 2026. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That seems to be the strategy taken by Hockey Canada Executive Director Wayne Gretzky. When he put together the 2006 roster, Canada was not only the reigning Olympic champion, but also won the 2004 World Cup of Hockey. It only made sense that core players like Jarome Iginla, Joe Sakic, and Chris Pronger returned. But in 2006, there were some serious red flags on the roster. Todd Bertuzzi is the big one. This was the first season after the lockout, and Big Bert was not even remotely close to the player he was in 02-03 when he scored 97 points. In the Olympic season, he only scored 71 points, 22nd amongst Canadian forwards, but it was his minus 17 that was the most concerning. This was the worst rating on the team. To put it in perspective, Shane Doan was second worst at minus 9. The selection of an over-the-hill power forward with no experience on Olympic-sized ice made no sense at all. Chris Draper was another poor selection. He wasn't even part of the 2002 team, but Canada felt that they could use his two-way checking ability. Still, a guy who only scored 32 points shouldn't be anywhere near the national team. I'm probably going to catch some flack for this, but I always felt like Shane Doan was overrated by Team Canada. Sure, he was on the roster for the World Cup winning squad, but that shouldn't guarantee you a spot on the Olympic team 2 years later. He only scored 66 points that season, and Canada left a ton of firepower at home. For one, Sidney Crosby. Yeah, I know he was a rookie, but he was a 100-point rookie and a generational talent. The inexperience argument only makes sense if Canada chose players who were better at the time than Crosby. Bertuzzi and Draper certainly weren't. Crosby's 102 points were third amongst Canadians that season. Fourth was Eric Stahl, who scored 100 points but was only deemed to be good enough for the taxi squad. Stahl probably took this to heart, because that summer he put the Canes on his back and won a Stanley Cup as a sophomore in the NHL. The fifth highest scoring Canadian, Marc Savard, had a career year scoring 97 points for the lowly and defunct Atlanta Thrashers. To be fair, he was a bit of a power play merchant, scoring 50 of his points on the power play, most of them Kovalchuk snipes. Jason Spezza scored 90 points in 68 games, a 108-point pace, only to make the taxi squad. Paul Kariya, key contributor from the 2002 games, was left at home even though he was having a renaissance season with the Preds, scoring 85 points. Daniel Briere was on pace for a 99-point season but was left off the team. I understand there are limited roster spots and you can't take everyone, but to leave your third, fourth, fifth highest scorer, your eighth highest scorer, a 99-point guy, all at home is unacceptable. And that is without even mentioning the Alex Tanguays, Patrick Marleaus, and Patrice Bergerons of the world, who statistically were having better seasons than most of Team Canada's forwards. On defense, Canada was a bit unlucky because of injuries to Ed Jovanovski and Scott Niedermayer. Two smooth skating, puck-moving defensemen, and it's a real shame because they needed these guys to balance out the old, immobile right side of Rob Blake and Adam Foote. The biggest mistake Team Canada made was promoting Brian McCabe from the taxi squad to the main squad. He was having a good season for the Leafs, but Dan Boyle would have given Canada a balance of lefties and righties. Instead, they went with 5 lefties and 2 righties. Plus, in my opinion, Boyle was a better player, more well-rounded, and a Stanley Cup champion. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that Regeer was not the right choice. He was not even the best Flames defenseman. At the time, that title belonged to a 20-year-old rookie Dion Phaneuf. Some of you may be laughing, but real ones remember that rookie Phaneuf was no joke. He was like a mix of Pronger and McInnes. Him not fulfilling his potential is one of the biggest what-ifs of his generation, along with Gilbert Brulé. Back to the topic at hand. In net, there was no real surprise. Martin Brodeur returned from the 2002 squad and was backed up by Roberto Luongo. This was Canada's strength, but as you're going to see, it doesn't matter when you can't score goals. As with every best-on-best international tournament, Canada expected nothing other than gold. They opened their title defense against the host nation, Italy, who, let's be fair here, were an all-star team of Canadians with Italian passports. The Italians actually put up a valiant effort early against Canada, who just landed in Turin 27 hours prior to puck drop. In the second period, the Italians tied the game up at 1. There was some concern amongst Canadians. Why are we not blowing these guys out? Afterwards, Todd Bertuzzi stated, "We know what we have to do. We kept building and building, our passes got better, and we started scoring goals. Once they got over their jet lag, scoring goals is exactly what the Canadians did, eventually winning 7-2. For their second game, the Canadians caught a bit of a break. The Germans knew that they didn't stand much of a chance against Canada, so they decided to rest goaltender Olaf Kolzig and keep him fresh for the Swiss and Italians. They started a 20-year-old Thomas Greiss, who was still in the German league at the time. The Canadians pounced on him early and often, taking a commanding 3-0 lead 10 minutes into the first. The Canadians put it in cruise control and won 5-1. Afterwards, Chris Pronger stated, "We're still getting our feet underneath us and dealing with the jet lag and all that. I think we'll have a lot more jump come Saturday for the Swiss game." Boy was he in for a surprise. And that surprise's name was Martin Gerber, who stood on his head making 49 saves in a 2-0 victory for the Swiss. The Swiss have won 3 IIHF silvers since, but this is still their biggest accomplishment in hockey. With Switzerland only being a 4-hour drive from Turin, this was practically a home game for the Swiss, and they fed off this energy. Afterwards, Canadian coach Pat Quinn stated, "It's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog." There was lots of fight in the Swiss players tonight. He was right. The Swiss were relentless, but also lucky. Canada had 2 goals waved off, one by Todd Bertuzzi due to goaltender interference, and this save by Gerber off of Rick Nash. The officials stuck with the call on the ice of no goal, much to the dismay of the Canadians. I still think there's a chance this puck crossed the line, but it's impossible to tell because the camera isn't mounted directly above the crossbar. Comment down below, goal or no goal? Martin Brodeur was not impressed by the Swiss, who by the way were coached by a Canadian, and had 2 goals from a Canadian-born Swiss player, former Leaf Paul DiPietro. Brodeur stated, "They didn't do anything special to beat us. They just played as boring as they could." That was worse than Devils hockey, that's for sure. And he was right. Canada outshot the Swiss 49-18 overall and 24-1 in the third, but they just couldn't beat Gerber. Brodeur gave way to Luongo in between the pipes the next day for Canada's match against Finland, who were a 3-0 juggernaut, led by a resurgent Teemu Selanne. After being shut out against the Swiss, you'd think the Canadians would get some puck luck. Absolutely not. The Finns scored twice in the first period, Teemu Selanne and Nico Kapanen. They guided this one home with their disciplined defensive game, and Tero Niittymaki made 24 saves for the shutout. Back-to-back shutout defeats. But Canada was still not demoralized. The holdovers from the 2002 squad drew parallels with that tournament's round robin. Joe Sakic stated, "We're facing adversity. We had it in 02, and we're facing it right now. It's better now than later in the tournament." Jerome McGinley stated, "The confidence hasn't changed and it's not cockiness or anything like that. But our goal is to make the medal round and get better and win a gold medal." But spectators could feel that something was off about this team. They just couldn't score, but they were also slow and disjointed. And if it weren't for the play of Roberto Luongo, they would have gotten blown out by the Finns. But they still had one round robin game to figure things out before the knockout stage. Czech Republic, who were led by Jaromir Jagr. Fortunately, Canada didn't have to face Dominik Hasek in net, who suffered an injury 9 minutes into the first game of the Olympics. Canada took advantage of this by scoring 3 goals in the first period, on backup goalie Tomáš Vokun. It was cathartic after being shut out in back-to-back games. But the Czechs were able to stop the bleeding and made a game out of it, ultimately coming up short by 1. This was not a convincing victory by any stretch of the imagination. Canada was thoroughly outshot 33-16 and the Czechs dominated territorially for most of the game. Brodeur stood on his head. In the second period, Canadians collectively held their breath as Brodeur went down with a knee injury. Luckily, he finished the game and was no worse for wear. Afterwards, he stated, "We'll hopefully take some positives off this. Although there were some negatives, it's time to be positive." Unfortunately, positivity will only get you so far, as you will see in part 3. A third place finish in Group A set up a date with the second place Russians from Group B. 15 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, they were having a renaissance. Alexei Kovalev stated, "We're trying to bring our hockey back to what you used to watch on TV as a young kid, moving the puck, making fancy plays." They definitely had the right group of guys to play this style. Pavel Datsyuk, Sergei Gonchar, Ilya Kovalchuk, and unlike Canada, they brought their young stars with them, Alexander Ovechkin and Evgeny Malkin. To make matters worse for Canada, the Russians were on a 4-game win streak. They were the opposite of Canada, young, fast, and could score at will. Chris Pronger laid out the game plan for Canada. We need to get back to Canadian hockey and just chip pucks in, finish our checks, create our turnovers, and get on the attack. We'll definitely revisit this quote in the conclusion. This is when the tournament really starts. Everything else up to this point is just a build-up, a warm-up. Now is when you've got to play. This was a tightly contested game. There were plenty of scoring chances in the first 2 periods, but neither side could score. In the 3rd period, the much maligned Todd Bertuzzi was sent off for interference. The Russians had a chance early in the period to take a lead, and that's exactly what they did. Canada had multiple swipes at the puck, but couldn't clear their zone. Viktor Kozlov made a neat pass to Ovechkin, who made no mistake beating Martin Brodeur. Brodeur played well in this game even though he was wearing a knee brace. Canada just couldn't generate any offense again, and this time it was Evgeny Nabokov's turn to shut out Canada. The Russians got a late goal from Captain Kovalev, and it was all over. Shock and disappointment for the Canadians. After the game, Pat Quinn stated, "I don't feel very good. You only get certain chances to stand as the best, and I really believed that we had a team that was capable of that." On the Russian side, there was jubilation. "Yeah, it's the biggest goal in my life. It's an unbelievable feeling. Right now, I'm very happy. I'm very excited," stated Alexander Ovechkin. The Canadians gave the Russians their due. Rob Blake stated, "That's the best Russian team I've played yet. I think you have to credit some of their young stars. Ovechkin, Kovalchuk, and there's guys who've been around like Kovalev and Yashin. They're very talented." That night in Turin, they were certainly more talented than the Canadians. But the question remains, how did Canada, the reigning 2-time best-on-best tournament winner, embarrass themselves so royally in Italy? And how can they prevent this from happening when the Olympics return to Italy? In part 1, we talked about roster selection. That's the primary reason this team lost. The management team was too loyal to those who helped them win in 2002, and left all their offensive talent at home, scoring only 3 goals in their final 4 games, getting shut out 3 times. Take a look at this forward group. Tons of size, but where's the speed? Especially on Olympic ice. The top line is 3 power forwards, and there's a big hulking forward on each line. Of course, Thornton and Nash deserve to be on the team, but these big skilled guys should have been surrounded by good skaters. Correa, Crosby, heck, even Andy McDonald could have helped in that department. Let's go back to this quote by Chris Pronger. "We need to get back to Canadian hockey and just chip pucks in, finish our checks, create turnovers, and get on the attack. Herein lies the problem. Canada was too focused on size and strength, whereas the European squads relied on skill, finesse, and defensive discipline. The defense was too slow at moving the puck and had difficulty connecting with the forwards, particularly the right side with a 34-year-old Adam Foote and a 36-year-old Rob Blake. Losing Niedermayer and Jovanovski certainly didn't help in this regard. Dan Boyle should have made the team. Sorry, Brian McCabe. Even though you were having a great season, Pat Quinn is probably the reason you made the team." Speaking of Quinn, he was well past his prime as a coach and couldn't make the adjustments that Canada needed. How can Canada avoid the same mistakes in 2026? Well, if Canada wins a 4 Nations face-off in 2025, that doesn't mean they can take the same group to Milan in 2026 and expect similar results. The game is different on bigger ice and will be played according to international rules, not NHL rules. So Doug Armstrong and Canadian management need to select the best players for the bigger ice. To add to that, they need to select the best 14 forwards instead of role players and trust the youth. If Connor Bedard or even Connor McMichael are in that top 14 group of forwards, take them with you. Age is just a number, and if you guys remember the 2010 Olympics, critics questioned the selection of a 21-year-old Jonathan Toews and a 20-year-old Drew Doughty. These guys turned out to be the best Canadian skaters in Vancouver and led Canada to gold. Finally, don't underestimate the opposition. The hockey world is rapidly catching up to Canada. After 10 years of no best-on-best tournaments, Canadians shouldn't just expect to pick up where they left off in 2014 and 2016. We saw how Canada was upset by Switzerland, and Canada better be prepared because the Swiss are in their division again, and the Swedes. I doubt it happens, but there's a real chance that Canada doesn't get a bye to the quarters and have to play in the qualification playoff, like how they did against Germany in 2010. I must also note, these groups are not final. We still don't know if Russia will be allowed to play. Whatever happens, I still fully expect Canada to win gold. That's all I have for you guys today. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, and I will see you next time. Cheers.